Time for an informative video. Greetings, my name is Nina, welcome back to my channel. Facts about me: I love stories about friendship, especially if it's a story about two bright individuals, each remarkable in their own right. I love such stories in fiction and in real life. Another fact about me, if you didn't know already, I really love fantasy genre. Who hasn't heard of Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia? I'm sure you heard of these series too, even if you happen to be the person who doesn't really get fantasy. And I'm sure you do. So the author of Lord of the Rings is named John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, and the author of Chronicles of Narnia is Clive Staples Lewis. Fact about both of these authors: they knew each other in real life. Not only they knew each other personally, but they were also, spoiler alert, very close friends. So in this video I'm going to dive deep into their friendship. There's a lot to uncover here. Their informal book club, Oxford, Fallout, and so on. Let's do this. Let's start with their meeting. C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien were both English professors at Merton College, Oxford. Two authors first met on May 11th, 1926. On the very same day after the meeting, Lewis went to write about Tolkien in his diary. Lewis described Tolkien as, quote, "a smooth, pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him. Only needs a smack or two." The two professors soon discovered that they both had common interests. In the evenings, when both were done with lecturing and tutoring, they dedicated their time to writing stories. Both of them loved myth, storytelling, and languages. Neither of them drove a car, so they walked everywhere around. Neither of them liked contemporary culture, and they were also bound by very similar experiences, although tragic. Both of them lost their parents at quite a young age, and both of them were haunted by their experiences in World War I. Sorrows from their past and the dislike for the contemporary culture turned both Lewis and Tolkien towards imagination and escapism, and the two authors had nicknames for each other. Tolkien nicknamed Lewis Jack, whereas Lewis nicknamed Tolkien Tollers. And a few years after they met, then came the Inklings. Both Lewis and Tolkien had busy schedules, but that didn't stop them from meeting each other. Since both of them loved stories, both to write stories and to read them, they decided to form an informal book club, which they eventually called the Inklings. The Inklings was a group where the members provided each other with creative support. The Inklings gathered at various different places near Oxford, particularly at the pub that was called Eagle and Child. The members shared their creative work and engaged in intellectual debates. When the members of the Inklings gathered at Eagle and Child, they had dinner and they engaged in various debates on various different topics. And then when 9 o'clock came, Lewis would ask, "Well, has anyone got anything to read?" Here's what Lewis wrote about the meetings. "It has also become the custom for Tolkien to drop in on me of a Monday morning for a glass. This is one of the pleasantest spots in the week. Sometimes we talk English school politics. Sometimes we criticize one another's poems. Other days we drift into theology or the state of the nation. Rarely we fly no higher than bawdy and puns." The Inklings meetings were times where Lewis, Tolkien, and their friends could meet each other, have fun, relax, and help each other improve to become better writers. Tolkien was the one to suggest the name the Inklings. The Inklings originates from Lewis' description of them as a round table of friends. According to C.S. Lewis biographer Alistair McGrath, the Inklings were a system of male planets orbiting its two sons, Lewis and Tolkien. Basically, they were Lars Ulrich and James Hetfield of this book club. Yeah, this is a very interesting comparison. Well, I mean that there were two driving forces forces behind Metallica, and same with the Inklings. The Inklings lasted around 20 years, approximately. This informal club was formed in early 1930s and disbanded in 1949. Now we're going to discuss how the two writers perceived each other's writings. Yes, definitely Tolkien and Lewis read each other's works. In public they praised each other's work, yet it was not exactly the case behind closed doors. Tolkien criticized the Narnia books, well, because first of all he didn't like the character of Father Christmas. Second, he thought that the books had an in-your-face allegory. And we know very well how Tolkien felt about allegories in general. Lewis, on the other hand, criticized The Lord of the Rings because he thought that the books were way too complex, were too hard to get through. The two writers disagreed on many aspects of literature and weren't exactly fond of each other's works. Tolkien said that the Narnia books were, quote, outside the range of my sympathy as much as my work is outside his. Tolkien even accused Lewis of recycling his own ideas for Middle-earth. Yes, Tolkien thought that Lewis took some ideas from him and recycled them. He called Lewis impressionable and his books creaking, stiff-jointed, and unoriginal. In return, Lewis considered Tolkien a perfectionist who never accepted any advice. So Lewis wrote, his standard of self-criticism was high, and the mere suggestion of a publication usually set him upon a revision in the course of which so many new ideas occurred to him, that where his friends had hoped for the final text of an old work, they actually got the first draft of a new one. Yes, it is said that Tolkien really loved to start things over and over again. Their writing paces were different too. Lewis rushed to finish the Narnia books, whereas Tolkien was prone to procrastination. Lewis wrote Narnia books in the case of 7 years, whereas it took Tolkien 17 years to write Lord of the Rings. Here's what McGrath wrote about Tolkien. He was a man of immense creativity, who nevertheless needed someone to affirm him in what he was writing, and more important, persuade him to finish it. So basically, in terms of writing pace, Lewis and Tolkien were Stephen King and George R.R. Martin of their time respectively. But it wasn't just the procrastination and perfectionism that kept Tolkien from writing. It were also another commitments to Oxford, to his wife and kids, and so on. Yeah, novels were easier and faster to write in comparison. Lewis and Tolkien respected each other, yet they had a very different taste in literature. Here's what Tolkien wrote. The most lasting pleasure and reward for both of us has been that we provided one another with stories to hear or read that we really liked, in large parts. Naturally, neither of us liked all that we found in the other's fiction. Despite this, it is said that if Lewis and Tolkien didn't cross paths and become friends, Narnia and The Lord of the Rings would have never seen the light of day. The two writers weren't afraid of criticizing each other's works, but like mentioned earlier, they were motivating each other to become better writers. So we have discussed how they met, the Inklings, and how they perceived each other's works. However, beyond all of that, beyond the Oxford and the Inklings and the writings, Tolkien also had a very strong influence on Lewis. When you first hear of J.R.R. Tolkien, when you go searching his biography, finding out of him, and so on, one of the very first things, if not the first one, that you find out about him is that he was a devout Catholic. Yep, he was a very religious man. C.S. Lewis, on the other hand, was an atheist. Well, at least he was one at the time he met Tolkien. So apparently Lewis wasn't very fond of faith and he would often chide Tolkien for his beliefs. Nonetheless, it were conversations with Tolkien that eventually turned an atheist Lewis into a believer. And then eventually Lewis' beliefs made their way in the Narnia books. However, despite becoming a believer, Lewis's approach to faith was very different from Tolkien's. Their views on faith was one of the reasons for their eventual fallout, which was caused by multiple factors, and we're going to address them later. Now let's discuss how they were perceived at Oxford. At Oxford, Tolkien and Lewis were in different factions of the English faculty. Lewis was in the literature faction, whereas Tolkien was into linguistics and history. After Tolkien converted Lewis into Christianity, Lewis started lecturing on Christian topics. This made him a literary celebrity at the university. In 1940, Lewis released a satirical story named The Screwtape Letters, which was popularized by BBC. By the time Narnia books were released, Lewis was already a household name. Tolkien's contribution, on the other hand, was a touchy subject at Oxford. His works on Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight granted him a status of a scholar. However, the publication of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings did not sit well among Oxford scholars. Said scholars didn't take Tolkien seriously due to him writing about wizards and dragons and elves and hobbits, even though the books were successful. They didn't like that he dedicated more time to writing fantasy books than to writing his academic articles, and then his colleagues would mockingly ask him, "How's your Hobbit?" Spoiler, Hobbit is doing well. Now, when I think about it, life came to imitate art to some extent. Remember the ending of The Hobbit? Spoiler if you have never read the book or seen any of the adaptations. When Bilbo Baggins returned home, he found out that he had lost more than spoons. He had lost his reputation. In short, the rumors of his adventures with wizards and dragons and elves and dwarves made him an oddball among his fellow hobbits. Tolkien's own adventure of writing and publishing The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings made him a real-life Bilbo in the eyes of the scholars. And finally we came to the fallout. Fallout began when an author named Charles Williams joined the Inklings. When Williams joined, the dynamics between Lewis and Tolkien changed. Lewis spent more time with Williams and distanced himself from Tolkien. Next factor was faith. We know that under Tolkien's influence, Lewis went from an atheist to a believer. However, there was a huge difference between their approach to faith. They were both Christian now, however, Lewis became an Anglican instead of devout Catholic like Tolkien. This didn't sit well with the latter. As we know, Tolkien took religion seriously, whereas Lewis's views on faith were more relaxed and chilled. Third factor was Lewis' marriage. Lewis' wife was an American, and by English standards, she was way too loud and outspoken, and that did not sit well with Tolkien. He then wrote to his son, "We were separated first by the sudden apparition of Charles Williams and then by his marriage, of which he never even told me. I learned of it long after the event." It is said that Tolkien eventually came to terms with Lewis's marriage. And we have already discussed their public image. In short, Lewis was well loved, whereas Tolkien was not, but at least at Oxford. And there was also the constant criticism from each other. Sure, they were honest with each other, sure, they motivated each other to become better, but nevertheless they were both eventually tired of the so-called brutal honesty. It did eventually affect the friendship. Despite drifting apart, Lewis still wrote to Tolkien, "I miss you very much," in 1949. Even though they had a fallout, Tolkien still visited Lewis when he got sick before his death. The incredible debt that I owe to him was not an influence but sheer encouragement. He was for long my only audience. And another thing he wrote now to his daughter after Lewis's death. "So far I have felt the normal feelings of a man of my age, like an old tree that is losing all its leaves one by one. This things feels like an axe blow near the roots. I can definitely tell you that a lot of these facts that I mentioned in this video I did not know myself before I started researching for this video, and it was very interesting to learn these things about these two writers. In overall, their friendship has faced a lot of ups and downs. However, they still stayed fond of each other, although not much of each other's magnum opuses. Lewis and Tolkien lived very quiet and ordinary lives. However, they had a very strong imagination that helped bring Narnia and Middle-earth to life. Their creative endeavors reached millions of people worldwide, and their books are well read to this day, 70-something years later, and they're going to be read in years to come. Personally, I would love to see a stellar biopic on their friendship. I say stellar because they made a biopic about Tolkien a few years ago, and yeah. Anyway, that's all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video about these two remarkable individuals. Are there some facts that you would love to add? Let me know down in the comments. See you next time. Goodbye.